A man lies on his back in the long grass, watching clouds drift, 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, 40,000 years ago. His stomach is full. His week's work is done. He has, by our calendar, 4 more days off. Cut forward, and in 1963, an anthropologist named Richard Lee sat down with the Jew/Hwanzi people in the Kalahari Desert and did the math on their week. Feeding yourself took 15 hours. That was the whole job. And before anyone writes that off as a fluke of the desert, the same number kept showing up everywhere anthropologists looked. The Hadza in Tanzania, the Ashe in Paraguay, the Martu in Australia, different continents, different game, different climates, and the working week kept landing somewhere between 15 and 20 hours, which means the thing you assume about ancient life, that it was a grinding, dawn-to-dusk fight against starvation, is basically a myth we invented to feel better about our own calendars. The bodies back this up. When paleopathologists examine skeletons from the last long stretch of the hunter-gatherer era, roughly 50,000 years ago, they find tall people, straight spines, full jaws of teeth, joints that never had time to grind themselves down. The skeletons of the first farmers only a few thousand years later are shorter, weaker, riddled with cavities, and dying younger. Something in the deal changed, and the strange part is that the people who traded down for it didn't know they were doing it. So if the food only cost 2 mornings a week, what were they doing with the other 5 days? The answer is going to sound suspicious, because it sounds like an ad for the life you wish you had. They were talking, they were making things, they were staring at the fire. Ethnographers who lived inside these communities logged something close to 6 hours a day of just social time, sitting with people, eating slowly, grooming children, telling long, meandering stories that had no point except the telling. And a huge chunk of the remaining time went into things that had no immediate survival value at all. Craft, ornament, art. In a South African cave called Blombos, archaeologists pulled out a string of shell beads with holes drilled through them, deliberately by hand, around 75,000 years old. Somebody spent an afternoon making jewelry before the last ice age even peaked. In a cave in southern Germany called Hohlfels, they found a flute carved out of the wing bone of a griffon vulture, 40,000 years old. Someone in the middle of the Pleistocene was practicing scales, which raises a question the textbooks tend to skip past. If survival was as brutal as we've been told, where were these people finding the time to invent music? And even those 15 hours weren't what your brain wants to picture when it hears work. A modern job wants you to do the same task for hours at a stretch, and your body was very much not built for that. A day of foraging looked more like this. You walked several miles with people you liked, tracking animals whose habits you'd been studying since you were 4. You knew maybe 200 plants by name, which were edible, which were medicine, which would kill your cousin. You made snap decisions about weather, terrain, and where the herd had probably gone. When you found something, you brought it back and everyone ate. The archaeologists who reconstruct those days describe them less like labor and more like a moving puzzle. Physically demanding, intellectually alive, socially thick. There was no separation between on the clock and off. There was no clock. The distinction between work and play, which we treat as a law of physics, is a very recent invention that showed up around the time we started building walls. The real answer to what they did with their days, though, might be waiting after dark. In 2014, an anthropologist named Polly Wiesner published a study that broke the day of the Jew Hwanzi into 2 completely different modes. During daylight hours, when people talked, most of the talk was practical. Who did what? Who owes what? Who's annoyed at whom? Gossip, logistics, the eternal admin of being human. But at night, around the fire, the conversation flipped. Wiesner recorded hundreds of hours of it and found that 81% of nighttime talk was stories, myths, jokes, impressions of relatives who lived 4 valleys over, long tales of ancestors and animals and people who never existed. Firelight, it seems, did something to the human brain. Softened it, opened it up, made it want to imagine instead of manage. There's a real argument to be made that culture was born in that window between dinner and sleep. Not in temples, not in schools, in the dark, around the coals, with everyone slightly bored and slightly warm. And the sleep that followed wasn't like yours either. Historical and anthropological records suggest people slept in 2 shifts, roughly 4 hours down, a quiet stretch of half waking in the middle to talk or think or make love, and then 4 hours more. Your uninterrupted 8-hour block is a factory schedule, not a human one. Which brings us to the moment it all went sideways. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, in several places at once, the Fertile Crescent, China, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, a handful of people figured out that if you buried certain seeds in the ground, food would obediently show up in the same spot next season. It sounds like a win. It looked like a win. And then it quietly ate everyone. Because farming has this vicious property nobody warned them about. It works. More food means more babies survive. More babies means more mouths. More mouths means more fields. More fields means more hours bent over, weeding, watering, defending, storing. And every time the population climbs, you can't just walk away from the granary and go back to the old life, because there are now too many of you to feed off wild plants. The door locks behind you. The archaeologist Jared Diamond called this the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Skeletons agree. Average height drops by about 4 inches. Life expectancy falls. New diseases arrive. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis. Most of them jumping over from the animals now living 6 feet from your bed. And for the first time in the 200,000-year existence of our species, some humans' hours started belonging to somebody else. And that is the corner nobody wants to look at directly. What we call civilization, the cities, the writing, the empires, the whole triumphant story of progress you were taught in school, is built on a trade the first farmers didn't know they were making. They gave up leisure for surplus. They gave up variety for reliability. They gave up their own time for someone else's granary. And once a few people control the surplus, they can hire soldiers. And once you have soldiers, you have taxes. And once you have taxes, your hours are no longer yours in any real sense. The word boss is a very recent invention. For 95% of the time our species has existed, no one has ever told a human being what to do with their Tuesday. We tend to describe hunter-gatherers as if they were an early draft of us, a rougher, poorer version waiting to be upgraded. The uncomfortable possibility is that we're the downgrade. But here's the twist that pulls this out of pure nostalgia. Those hunter-gatherer societies weren't paradise. Infant mortality was brutal. A bad injury could kill you at 20. Interpersonal violence in some groups ran shockingly high. And the same leisure that produced Blombos beads also produced long feuds and rough justice. What the evidence actually shows is stranger than they had it better, or they had it worse. It shows a life where the terrible parts were sharp and short, and the good parts, the talking, the storytelling, the 6-hour afternoons, were long and thick and everywhere. Modern life inverts that. The catastrophes are rarer. The dull grind is constant. You are statistically less likely to be killed by a leopard and statistically more likely to spend a decade of your waking hours in a fluorescent room negotiating a spreadsheet. Neither life is free. They just charge you in different currencies. Somewhere in a modern career, you will work roughly 90,000 hours. That's the going estimate. 90,000 hours traded over a lifetime for the pension that finally lets you stop trading them. 90,000 hours to buy back the version of life a hunter-gatherer child was born already holding. There's something almost comic about it if you don't think too hard. The evenings by the fire, the long afternoons doing nothing in particular, the slow meals with people you love. We spend our whole working lives chasing them, and our ancestors had them as the default setting. So somewhere out there, right now, an alarm is going off at 6:47, and somebody is stumbling past 2,000 generations of watching ancestors on their way to the coffee maker. Remember who the strange one is. We are the experiment. That man in the grass watching clouds on a Tuesday afternoon, he is the control group, and he lived most of his life doing something we still haven't quite figured out how to schedule, being alive on purpose. What would you do with a 15-hour week?